We are, I think, indeed honored to have our guest speaker, Dr. Adesina, with us. Akin is no stranger to Cornell. Indeed, he has been to our campus several times, but this time we, along with Chris Barrett, invited him to stay with us for some time. So he's around for several weeks, and I think he's a real dynamic force, as you will get to learn and know him over the ensuing weeks. Akin has had 2 decades of scholarship to the question of international development. He's published widely, he's thought deeply, he has looked at the African farmer perspective, and I think it grows back into his own personal roots. He's a graduate of CIIFAD University in Nigeria, where he finished first class with honors. He then went on to Purdue University to do the master's and PhD in agricultural economics, then having a wonderful career in the international research centers in Africa and in Asia. And then in 1998, he joined the Rockefeller Foundation to head up the office in Southern Africa, and subsequently he is deputy director of the Rockefeller Foundations and then intimately involved with the AGRA program. He has received numerous awards. Outstanding Agricultural Economist. He has received the Yara Award for the significant person who made an impact on African agriculture, and a real leader, president of the African Agricultural Economics Association, as well as on the board member of the International Ag Econ Association. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my real honor and distinct pleasure to introduce to you a good friend, a colleague, a person who I think has made enduring contributions to the literature of economic development in general and to Africa's growth in particular. Dr. Adesina.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real delight to be here at Cornell University. First, let me express my appreciation to Ralph Christie, he's a longtime friend of mine, and also to Chris Barrett, who I'm working with at Cornell here. I'm actually here working on a book, so it's really great to be here. Secondly, was when I decided to go to grad school, one of the places where I was admitted was actually Cornell University. And I was trying to run away from the cold. And so I decided to go to Purdue University. But my first semester at Purdue University, the temperature was minus 50 degrees below zero with wind chill. So I'm not sure whether running away from Cornell did me any good. But anyway, thanks for your nice weather this time around. So I think I'll stick around for a little bit. It's good to be here. Thanks for making time for this seminar. I'm going to be speaking to you about Africa's food crisis, conditioning trends, and development policy. First, let me start off by what is a very well-known problem, which is that Africa is the region of the world where you find the malnutrition has continued to rise. If you look at Asia over the last 35 years, the share of the population living actually, that are malnourished has gone down by about 2/3. And most of that came from the Green Revolution that Asia had in the 60s and early 70s. But if you look at Africa, it is the, oops, what was that? Okay, this one. Africa is where you still have a high share of the population that is malnourished, and that population has continued to rise with population also because of rising poverty on the continent. So we're talking about the continent where the food challenge is still a big issue. Now here we see what has happened with respect to the food crisis and the financial crisis that the world went through in recent times. Now that food crisis hurt Africa in many ways. First is that because majority of the population are net buyers of food, whether in the urban areas and also in the rural areas, the net buyers of food were disproportionately negatively affected by that. And I must say that in Africa, roughly about 70% of the household income is actually spent buying food. So you can understand the impact that that really had on that segment of the population. Second is the amount of money being spent importing food. And that has risen significantly for what used to be $10 billion to recently now $30 billion a year importing food. And that has huge implications, obviously in terms of fiscal balance for the countries, but macroeconomic stability problems for many of these countries, but not to talk about social, political crisis that many of these things leads to. And many of you read the papers about the riots that you had in many of these countries because of this crisis. So this is not a trend that we want to see continuing, and a lot of efforts are being done to turn this around. I'll share some of those with you. But let me share this slide with you with respect to what has happened to African agriculture in the last 30 years or so. Africa's food problem is not a transitory problem. It's a structural problem where per capita food production has continued to decline over the last 30 years plus. And you can see the slide here where many of the countries that benefited from the Green Revolution in Asia were able to significantly raise agricultural productivity. But Africa's agricultural productivity per capita has continued to be on a decline. And literally, if you are one of those that like to skate, you can almost put a skating board on this thing and you can skate it through. That is the kind of situation that Africa has continued to have. And you don't solve that problem by simply giving food aid. You've got to go to the root cause of the problem and turn that agricultural productivity around. Now, here is the decomposition of the productivity growth or production growth in different parts of the world by whether you're expanding based on area, expanding based on the use of modern inputs, seed fertilizers, and so on, or whether you're really expanding based on land. Here is, let me just focus on Asia. You can see that bulk of the increase in Asia actually came out of yield increases from improved varieties, but also from the use of fertilizers and water and all of that. If you turn here, basically this color here tells you that it is basically coming out of area. And so the food production growth that we see in Africa, it's not a sustainable trend in the sense that you've seen expansion into very more marginal areas as populations begin to expand food production by simply cutting down more land. And I must say that in terms of the deforestation rate in Africa is 200% above the global average. So that's the kind of level that we are talking about in terms of deforestation. But let me say that that picture that I've just given you masks a lot of heterogeneity in the sense that many of you might have seen the work of the CIIFAD. I know many of you here that have worked a long time in the CIIFAD. There's a lot of great stuff out there with respect to Nerika rice. Peter Matlin used to be my director when I was in WADA way back earlier in my career, where Nerika rice, huge potential, drought-tolerant maize in southern Africa, huge potential, cassava in IITA, huge potential. So I'm not saying that not a lot is going on. I'm just saying that it's not enough to tilt this kind of challenge that we face. Another problem is what's happening with fertilizers. Now, fertilizers used in Africa, it's actually the least in the world. It's only 8 kilograms per hectare, compared to the global average of probably about 120 kilograms per hectare. Now, if you look at this slide here, you have a crisis of sorts on both sides of this distribution. On the upper side of that distribution, you have an overuse of fertilizers in the developed countries that have continue to have huge agricultural productivity growth. But everywhere, and I'm sorry if you can't see it from the back, but everywhere you can't see anything on this y-axis here is where the African countries are. And so it's no brain surgery to really understand why productivity is actually very low in African agriculture, because fertilizer use, for example, accounts for way over 45% of global increases in agricultural production. And so clearly we've got to solve this problem. And when I was at Rockefeller Foundation, we actually took a big stab at that. We organized, I helped to organize in Rockefeller Foundation an Africa Fertilizer Summit, where we brought African heads of state together to look at all sides of that problem, from the demand side, from the supply side, from the infrastructure side, and all of that to agree to raise the level of use of fertilizers to roughly 50 kg per hectare from about 8 kilograms per hectare. A lot of things are happening on that, as you will see later on. So what Africa basically needs, therefore, is a green revolution. But it needs a different kind of green revolution. It's not the kind of revolution that we had in Asia, with all the successes, I must say, that actually had. That green revolution for Africa has to be different in the following ways. First, it has to consider that Africa has different kind of crops that Asia had. Asia had wheat, it had rice, and that was basically it. Okay, I'm from Nigeria. We eat yams, we eat cassava, sweet potato, beans, and rice, and all kinds of stuff. So a lot more crops, and that adds to the complexity of the challenge. The second is that this is largely rain-fed agriculture. Asia was largely irrigated agriculture. And in Africa, less than 5% of total arable land is actually under irrigation. So it's a different level of challenge. Third is the diverse agroecological zones. You look at it all over, from humid zones, Sahelian zones, moist savanna zones, highly variable areas. So really, you cannot have a one-size-fits-all, one-shot silver bullet solution. You need what Gordon Conway in his book has called this rainbow green revolution. Different types of revolutions are there. And the other thing to look at, I would say, are more the environmental issues, which came out of the challenge of the Asian Green Revolution. And that is biodiversity. And the other one has to do with the issue of environmental externalities that arose from the use of pesticides and things like that. So the point I'm trying to make is this. We've got to recognize that the Green Revolution worked in Asia. Africa needs its own Green Revolution, but it's different. But it must take on board these critical areas of sustainability and biodiversity, which I think are going to be key. AGRA, which is the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, was established in 2006 to help meet that challenge. And here, I'm glad actually at this seminar that I have my previous bosses here, Bob Hurt, who actually hired me at Rockefeller Foundation, and Peter Matland, who mentored me very early in my career. We decided that it was time to take on this challenge. And so Rockefeller Foundation and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation put together this partnership called Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. Currently, that alliance has about $420 million, and that is being deployed across the areas you see there: seed systems, soil health, markets, policy extension, and the whole area of innovative finance. The point I want to make here is that we've got to get all these things to work together. It's not just a single, just getting the seed, but you've got to get everything to work together. So that's what AGRA is. Now, but AGRA was established. This slide shows you the external assistance to agricultural R&D between 1970 and 2003. And you can see the backdrop against which we had to establish AGRA, which is that of declining bilateral aid going into agriculture. All-time high here of roughly 17% of all bilateral aid going to agriculture. To 2003 went just about 3%. And so, but the other trend you see is the increase in support for international agricultural research. And so a lot of focus on generating global public goods. But I understand global public goods. I appreciate global public goods. But I always say that nobody eats global public goods. People eat food. And so we've got to find a way of translating all of that into things that people can eat that have impact on the ground in Africa. This is the same in terms of the ODA support to agriculture. You can see the slides again all the way down. And why is this? Most of this is happening because of misplaced priorities. There was a lot of people who felt that agriculture is not the engine for driving down poverty. And so it's a big shift with the Millennium Development Goals towards focusing on the social sectors. There's health, education, and so on. So agriculture got left out of it. But that was a tragic mistake as far as Africa is concerned. That is changing on the continent. African governments have gotten together to create a new program called Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program, or CAADP. And basically what it asks for is two. It says that they want to put in 10% of their money into agriculture, so which means a lot more support goes into the sector than before. And secondly, to achieve a 6% increase in agricultural growth. Now, this is where the challenge is. You cannot achieve 6% increase in agricultural growth, especially if you're looking at staple crops, unless you have rapid increase in agricultural productivity, which really means you need to have a green revolution for those staple crops, for this kind of CAADP agenda to succeed. Now, some of my big issues of why we got here was structural adjustment. And I'm not going to beat up on this for too much, but just to make the point that as far as I'm concerned, and for those that know me over the time in my career, I think it was a disaster with respect to Africa, in the sense that the assumptions made were actually not the right assumptions, right? I mean, you were assuming that the government could be taken out of agriculture, where we've got 60% of the population, 70% of the population, and value added in agriculture is very huge as part of our GDP. Government can forget all that, let the private sector get in, smoothly everything's going to work. It didn't work. And so we're stuck today with a situation where the markets are poorly organized, they are not functioning, the farmers are very poor, and Chris Barrett has written quite a lot to talk to us about the deepening of the poverty traps structurally that you have on the continent. So basic point is we don't need a Washington consensus. It was a wrong consensus as far as Africa is concerned. We need a consensus that is based on evidence. Now, look here, the share of agriculture in the global economy in different countries compared to Africa. Here on the blue colors here, this is the agricultural GDP as share of total GDP. And the red ones tells you the subsidy as a percentage of the agricultural GDP. Obviously, this is very clear. The parts of the world where agriculture is not important is where all the money is going. And the part of the world where agriculture is critical for livelihoods get absolutely no support. Now, if you look at it in terms of actual values, in terms of support per hectare, here you look at subsidies in OECD countries and sub-Saharan African countries. You can see it in terms of the values. You see Africa, actually nothing. So essentially what I'm saying is this, that the structural adjustment mindset and the market liberalization mindset, I've got nothing against markets, swung to the other end in which African farmers today have absolutely no support. No support for information, to finance, no support for credit, no support for price stabilization, no support for insurance, for almost anything. In fact, African farmers today are the least supported in the world. It's almost like going to an Olympics in which you're supposed to run with everybody else. And then you got no shoes, and everybody else is going running, and winning, and you're supposed to win. You can't. The point is, we've got to move away from policies of abandonment to policies of support if you're going to get out of this morass in Africa. And that is happening. We are doing a lot with African heads of state. This is the president of Malawi that makes such a powerful statement. I will not have the indignity of having to beg for food. And why should they? When we were in Rockefeller Foundation with Bob and Peter, we were doing quite a lot in Malawi, trying to get the Malawian government to support research and productivity growth. And then we went on later on to support them in policy design. We worked with the president of Malawi to put in place what you can call smart subsidies, which is basically support, income transfer to the farmers that they take to a rural shop, which is called an agro dealer, and then they get their seed and fertilizers that they need in most cases. And sometimes the government also supplies the seed and the fertilizers. What big impact. This country was on the verge of starvation in 2005. Today, if you look at it in 2005, 2006, they produced in 1 year 400,000 metric tons of maize surplus. The next year, 1.3 million tons of maize surplus. They supply maize to Zimbabwe. Last year, they supplied maize to Kenya. And that tells you that it doesn't really take a long time to turn this kind of trend around if you have the political will to actually attack the problem. Now, in my case, I think that with the way we've been looking at subsidies, in my view, is the wrong way as far as Africa is concerned. I don't see subsidies as subsidies. Subsidies is what you give to rich people, right? What we're talking about here is what I call growth enhancement support. In this following sense, we have farmers that are locked in these poverty traps here. And we're trying to get them out of that poverty trap to be able to have some surplus accumulation, and eventually they can benefit from global trade by diversifying to high-value crops and so on over time. But we can't do that if everybody's stuck here. And so what we really need is growth enhancement support, where you provide support for them to get to a particular level of income in which they can then begin to take advantage of economic opportunities. So for those that actually want to have a debate about subsidies, I don't want to have that debate. I want to have a debate about growth enhancement support, because that's exactly what we need, not subsidies. Now, what are some of the lessons that we can draw from this? First is that we have serious poverty traps in Africa, and we have to address that problem. Second is that markets alone cannot do this thing. We do need to have government support, matching markets to be able to deliver it. We need growth enhancement support, and I can say that regardless of what you do in agriculture, good governance over the agricultural sector is critical to make sure that farmers get access to the support that they should be getting. Bananas, and I'm glad that my friend Frank Pedraza is here. Bananas is something that Rockefeller Foundation helped Uganda to do a lot with tissue culture bananas in particular. And with tissue culture bananas, the average yields of bananas went up from roughly 8 tons per hectare to about 15, 20, even 30 tons per hectare in Uganda. Now, remember when I went to Uganda to visit with the president of Uganda, with the then president of Rockefeller Foundation, Professor Gordon Conway, he told us, he said, well, thanks very much, Rockefeller Foundation. You've increased all these bananas, but everything is like, banana is the #1 environmental problem we have. It's all over the street. And he said, please do us one favor. Help us to clean it up. And so we reached out to Ralph and to Frank, and we tried to really put a program together for them. I must report here that that program is working, because in 2009, 20,000 farmers growing these bananas in Uganda sold $3.5 million worth of bananas because of improved collective action in marketing, also in the way that they sell the bananas. Instead of big bunches like this, they cut it back into little bunches and they clean it and they sell it. This slide talks about the contribution of to GDP of different types, staple crops, livestock, and all the others. The important thing is to recognize here that staple crops is where the biggest growth is going to come for Africa. We can talk about all we want about tea, or coffee, cotton, and all that, but staple crops is where the real engine of growth is going to be. And so we do need new types of policies, though, to address this staple crop sector, in particular the ones that are bulky, difficult to store and to transport, like the bananas that I've just mentioned to you. And I really think that those policies have to look at the following. Fiscal policies, especially for agro-processing, because agro-processing is a big area but highly undercapitalized in Africa. We do need investment policies. If we can have in Africa export trading, export zones that are free of taxes, why is it that we cannot have staple crop processing zones in which we give incentives for those that are actually doing that are close to rural areas, both financial incentives but also infrastructural support to be able to stimulate the processing. Now, let me turn to fifth trends as I now wind down here. I want to talk about global financing for agriculture, the rush for land in Africa, climate change, and carbon market financing, because those 4 areas are critical challenges that we face in Africa as we are working on the African Green Revolution. Now, this slide tells you how much financing is required for the African Green Revolution. According to IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, we need roughly about $53 billion, but with about $17 billion for infrastructure alone. The point basically is it's going to cost a lot of money. It did in India because you had to put in the tube wells, the irrigation, and all these systems. However, the debate is, how are we going to do that? How are we going to get that in Africa? This slide here is one that was at a meeting in Bellagio in Rockefeller Foundation. Peter, you will probably remember. Here is Mick Namara, president of the World Bank, and Norman Borlaug, late Norman Borlaug, and Frosty Hill and Lowell Harding, and all of you will probably remember all these folks. They came together in Bellagio and said, we need to get global financing behind the Asian Green Revolution. And they did. Mick Namara put a lot of money of the World Bank behind the Green Revolution. And so today that we are talking about the African Green Revolution, we need exactly that kind of support. So what we did in 2008 was 40 years after, we put together a meeting that brought leaders from around the world. You can probably recognize Jeff Sachs here and Vice President of the World Bank, everybody else, to talk about the same thing. And as a result of that debate, not only because of that debate, but partly due to that debate, the issue rose up in the G8 discussions. And today the G8, as you know, in L'Aquila has put up $20 billion. Hopefully you see the money. I'm not sure whether it's going to be real money or old money. But anyway, there's a lot of money that have been promised to agriculture. So clearly the question is, how will this new money be spent? Will it be spent the same old ways? I believe that this new money ought to be used to leverage government money and not displace domestic financing. And I also believe that these monies have to go to higher potential areas more than the lower potential. I don't want to say the less than lower potential areas, but certainly not the fringe areas. We've got to show success in African agriculture, and we can't disperse money everywhere. Now, but something else is happening with respect to financing of agriculture, and that is the flow of net private capital inflows into Africa, and we've got to pay attention to that. And you can see here, remittances, of course, has been growing, which helps a lot of poor households. But also here, in terms of the net foreign direct investment in Africa has continued to be on the rise. So we've got to pay attention to the financial sector here and how to leverage that sector into agriculture. When you look at agriculture in Africa today, where we have a bulk of our population, it's very sad that only 3% of total private capital goes into agriculture, where we really have most of the people. So there's a real lack of congruence in terms of the amount of money going in and the sector, real sector, where the money ought to be going into. And there are many reasons why the banks are not lending to agriculture. The transaction costs are very, very high. The risks are very high. In most cases, the banks don't have the capacity to understand the sector and to deploy financing for that sector. This is an area that we decided to take on at AGRA, because if we're going to raise the money for the Green Revolution, and we know that some guys are saying the government shouldn't support it, well, quote-unquote subsidies, we've got to work with the private sector and mobilize that financing. And in doing so, we have decided that the best way to do it is to reduce the risks that banks are facing. In this slide here, you see the GDP. Agriculture has a total share of GDP, and where you can't see anything in here again is just the amount of loans that's going into agriculture. And so we decided that the key to doing this is to reduce the passive risk of lending in this particular space by the banks. Let me give you an example. When we were at Rockefeller Foundation, Bob was head of a Provenex program, which is a program we had, and we put in $500,000 into a small bank in Uganda, which is called CIIFAD, Centenary Rural Development Bank. $500,000 5 years after, when Rockefeller Foundation did an assessment of that work, it had leveraged $4 million from the bank, okay? And the Rockefeller Foundation lost only $10,200 in the whole five-year period, right? The point I'm trying to make is this. The banking sector in Africa has high passive risk of lending than the real risk of lending. And of course, if you try to help them to build their capacity, you de-risk the input market, you de-risk the output market, you are actually making it easier for them to be able to lend into that sector. So let me share with you quickly some of the experiences and successes that we are seeing in Africa today. Is anybody here from Kenya? All right, good. In your country, in Kenya, we work with CIIFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and put together a risk-sharing facility of $5 million, which we used to leverage $50 million from Equity Bank. As you know, it's a great bank in Kenya. And they are lending all across the value chain. For the last 1 year, they have lent almost $10 million to small-scale farmers, $2.5 million to large-scale farmers, $1 million to agribusinesses, for a total of 27,000 smallholder farmers that have gotten loans in just 1 year. And what do we do that made the difference? Was we decided to share the risk with the bank and also to build the capacity of the bank to deliver the loans to farmers and to help the farmers build their capacity to actually efficiently utilize the credit that they were getting. It works. There is no magic there. And in the life of me, I don't understand why in Africa we've never really been getting the commercial banks to lend to smallholder farmers. Those who default in Africa tend not to be a lot of farmers, smallholder farmers. They are the politicians. And when they default big. So we're looking at the wrong crowd here. This is what happened. This was me working with the president of Kenya. The point I wanted to raise here was, if we are trying to work with banks, we've got to get the governments to do the right things. Because if the government policy is wrong, and then the banks begin to lend, and the government throws in an agricultural development bank, bingo, the whole thing goes off. So it is critical to work with the government to have the enabling environment for this to happen. In Tanzania, We put up another facility which was about $2.1 million with our partners, and it has leveraged $10 million in loans for small agro dealers. And agro dealers are basically small shops that sell seed and fertilizers in rural areas. And for many of these in Tanzania, that's the first time ever that they were getting loans from any bank at all. We've put together another one with Standard Bank, which is Africa's largest bank. Agra and its partners put together a risk-sharing facility of $10 million, which leveraged $100 million from Standard Bank. That's the largest amount of any bank lending to farmers in Africa today. And this is working in Mozambique, Tanzania, Ghana, and Uganda, targeting about 700,000 plus farmers. Of course, the lending is also for the whole value chain. Now, where we are today is a fund which is called Impact Investing Guarantee Fund. And what this fund is going to do is, instead of us working with each of the banks separately, this fund will create a syndicated risk-sharing pool that the banks can bid for at the same time. So you create competition, lower the interest rate for farmers, and we're just capitalizing the fund at $150 million to be able to leverage $1.5 billion into smallholder agriculture to allow farmers to buy seeds and fertilizers and so on that they need. So this is a big thing that we are working on right now. Now, with respect to land grabs, you all know the land grab story. I'm not going to go to it too much, but I just want to make a number of points. So this is rising all across. We know that, the land grab for Africa. But let me say that Africa's land should not be up for garage sale. Africa's land is productive assets. It's got to be used mainly for the smallholder farmers, not to be an extractive sector where you have foreign investment. I'm not against foreign investment, but this has to be focused on smallholder farmers to be able to retain their land, produce, and African governments then can structure supply contracts with investor countries if they want to buy food. But there's no reason why Africa ought to be giving away a lot of land. But that's the point of debate that we can have. Let me skip this and just go on to the issue of climate change. Climate change is perhaps the greatest challenge that we face for the Green Revolution in Africa. Many of the projections show that in some areas you may not even be able to produce maize in future. You can see most of the red areas here are areas where yield is going to go down by about 25 to 15%. However, when I was doing my PhD thesis, I was looking at the variability of weather, and that was 1984, 85. And you can see that although the long-term trend is that the temperature is rising, the key is the variability here. It still remains. So what we really have to worry about, it's not the long-term rise in temperature, but how to cope with these variabilities here. And that means that we don't have to do anything drastic, in my view. I think we just have to focus on developing appropriate crop varieties that are drought tolerant, invest in irrigation, crop insurance. I was discussing today with Chris, also with respect to asset insurance for livestock that he's talking about. We found that in most of the cases, the suitability of the areas where you grow crops doesn't change much with respect to the climate change scenarios that people are talking about. And so I've just talked about the kind of instruments that you can use, the standard ones. You got to share the risk, you got to invest in irrigation, drought tolerance, and all of that. Now, carbon markets is one I want to close with because I think the size of the carbon market is growing rapidly. It's grown from about $19 billion in 2006 to $30 billion in 2007. Of course, deforestation is the big issue with respect to carbon. And that is where the Green Revolution comes in. The Green Revolution, it's not competing with the carbon agenda. In fact, what we ought to do, in my view, is instead of worrying about the clean development mechanism, which doesn't really help us anyway, let's figure out how to get agriculture into that climate agenda and to finance agriculture using carbon bonds. There's no reason why governments cannot float carbon bonds in Africa and be able to use that spread to finance the access to seed, fertilizers, and create avoided deforestation. Because at the end of the day, you've got to reduce the deforestation. And if you did, this is what you will get. For Africa, there's a lot to be gained in focusing on avoided deforestation. So as I close, what are then the priorities that I want to leave with you First is that it's critical to accelerate support for the Green Revolution in Africa. It's the greatest agenda that Africa has right now. Second is we need home-based policies. I've said that we don't need Washington consensus, we need an African consensus, but that has to be evidence-based, and you've got to build the capacity to be able to do that. Third is that whatever support Africa gets has to be smart in the sense that donors should use their money to leverage our own domestic resources, not to displace our own domestic resources. Fourth is that banks are going to have to play a bigger role. We've got to do a better job of understanding the risk that banks face and helping to de-risk a lot of the issues, the financial markets and input and output markets that they see huge risk in. The issue of land for women is critical. Women form 60 to 70%, sometimes even higher, in Africa of the farming population. And we've got to make sure that as the Green Revolution takes off, that we don't create inequities by not having the women benefiting from technical change that we're going to get simply because they don't have access to secure land rights. With respect to the issue of land acquisitions, I think what is really critical there is to think about how that affects Africans themselves. It makes little sense to be starving and then to be giving away your land. So we've got to make sure that there are really good codes of conduct here that make sure that there's transparency and that communities don't lose their land in the process. The need to scale up weather index insurance, both for crops and also for assets, that I said that it was nice to talk to Chris this morning about what he's doing. And finally, the issue of carbon bonds. Ralph started by introducing me that, from my own experience, my father was a farmer. And he had to run away from the farm when he was 14 years old because agriculture didn't pay for him, right? And eventually he went on to become a government auditor. And I asked him one day, why did you do that? And he told me that agriculture doesn't pay. He said, one day I want you to know that if you ever get into a position in life that you can change something, make agriculture work for the poor because there are so many millions whose lives depend on it. And so I think, like many of you here, my passion, my commitment, my life is really about these kids. It's about the future and the hope of a continent that has been locked out of development simply because the majority of them depend on agriculture. That doesn't work. And I'm sure that with the Green Revolution we are working with, and with many partners like yourself and others, I'm sure we will turn this around. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have a few moments for some questions. I see Peter and I see Norm, and then let's go with the gentleman in the far back and the gentleman in the row right here. Let's get these four out as quickly as we can. So Peter, Norm, my friend in the back row. Yes, tell me your name again.
Daniel.
Daniel, right. And then the gentleman right here in the seat. Let's get four questions out because I think there'll be a lot of questions we need to cover. Peter.
Okay, first, excellent presentation. As an agronomist, the technical issue is that, yes, I agree you need good seed and you need to provide the nutrients, and how you do that can be done different ways. But another issue is water. And so water harvesting, and linked with water harvesting is the whole issue of erosion. That if you can't contain erosion, then adding more fertilizer is not going to solve your issue. And this will require maybe a village or community action, a watershed level. So I'm talking more of an agronomist. You didn't talk anything about agronomy. So I just keep everybody honest in this.
Forgive the economist. Yeah.
As opposed to the economist.
But I agree with you that water is actually very critical. And I think it's an area that AGRA itself is moving into right now in terms of small-scale irrigation, water management, water harvesting technologies, and also to even get more water-efficient crops. I think that's also one part to look at.
So let's go to Norm, Daniel, and the gentleman here, and then after that, Eric Thorbeck has a question.
Thank you, Keen. I just want to go beyond Peter's question. I was thinking as you talk, I like to talk, about, I wonder if you'd come to Cornell instead of going to Purdue. You would have been able, as an economist, to talk about agricultural development all this time, cover so many things, and never mention soil or soil fertility. To me, this has become the really important element, especially in Africa, because the conditions, which are getting worse, are going to make the soil more and more inert. And Chris Barrett, you may know, did some work in Western Kenya, looking at the returns to investment in fertilizer, and found that until you got your soil organic matter up to 3 to 4%, didn't pay to put a nitrogen fertilizer because the soil could not respond to that input of nitrogen nutrients. And so I think we got some really fundamental agronomic questions. Water is part of it, I agree with Peter, but also the soil fertility, soil biology, the life in the soil. And it's not there in much of Africa. And so until we figure out strategies for getting the soil functioning as a system, seems to be a lot of things you're talking about here, even marketing, isn't going to go very far.
And erosion control is one of them.
I think that we got the soil question out. Daniel?
So I'm coming from a sociological background. So like the previous questions before, I'll kind of privilege my background. Now I've been looking at the very same data that you are using for making the case for a green revolution. And what I find is that in fact, over the last, especially starting around structural adjustment when it was at the onset of those programs, you have a decline in cereals and all other kinds of staples, but correspondingly an increase in export crops. So things like cotton, like coffee in some cases, especially tea and tobacco. So it seems to me that a framework that includes only cereals kind of obscures the very complex trends in the agricultural systems. And it might be that there are things around how decisions are made either at national level or at household level that are shaping the choices around what people will produce. And I wonder if indeed AGRA is including these complexities in your model. Second is the issue of commercialization of agriculture. And again, I'm surprised that having just talked about structural adjustment programs and their devastation, you then bring in commercialization of agriculture, and I wonder how, if that in fact is not rehearsing solutions that have failed in the past. And I say this especially because of your use of bananas and maize in Malawi. Now, bananas in Uganda are grown mostly in the southwestern part, and they're really a commercial crop. And in this area, there is very deep child malnutrition because of the over-commercialization of agricultural activity. In fact, because of this process, at the same time, you're having huge displacements. You have elite groups in Kampala who then go in and purchase huge chunks of land in order to plant bananas for export. So there seems to be some interesting social processes that get missed out of the picture. Malawi also uses...
Daniel, excuse me.
Just one...
No, excuse me, Daniel. We were trying to get as many questions as we can. So could you briefly state the question, and we'll get it started, because there are many others who want to ask questions.
Yes. Just one last comment. Malawi, it seems to me that although they have tripled their maize production, their food insecurity situation might not have.
Good. And the gentleman right here. And then you're going to respond to that round of questions, from soil to the complexities, and then this final question.
Sorry, thanks for coming. I'm sorry that The Economist comes and we're all very critical. But kind of following up with that, we had a panel discussion a few weeks back where we talked about gender issues. And one of them was that the commercialization of agriculture and cash crops benefits men more than it does women. And I'm skeptical that securing legal land rights for women would reduce those gender inequalities with the increased commercialization and increased focus of cash crops. So I was just wondering if you guys are doing anything to address that.
Right.
So we're going to handle those three.
All right,
rounds.
fine. No, thanks very much for the comments. Let me start out with Nam. I think if Gebisa Ejeta was here, he will tell you that I did take a lot of agronomy. Actually, most of my work actually was working on agronomic issues. But your points are excellent points. I think with respect to soils, when you look at Africa, the extent of soil nutrient mining that is going on, it's quite enormous. Roughly $4.5 billion of soil nutrients are lost every year from soil nutrient mining. And you're right also with respect to the soil degradation that is actually occurring because of lack of erosion control. But equally important, I think, is the role that organic matter plays in the system. The problem in Africa is it's not whether you need organic matter, it's that many people over time have thought that organic matter ought to replace fertilizers. You know, they use agroforestry, alley cropping, improve fallows. All those things are great. And so you got to really have both your organic and inorganic inputs working complementarily together. But at the end of the day, though, I think what we really have to make sure that we do is without getting fertilizer in the system, in my view, I think we're wasting time. I think you need fertilizers to give you that boost. You get the biomass, and then you can integrate that more into the system. You have a greater chance of success than otherwise. The other one is the issue of biological nitrogen fixation, which you mentioned. There's a huge opportunities here for grain legumes in particular, for pigeon peas, for cowpeas, from groundnuts, and soybeans, and so on. And we are working on those and promoting those in a big way in Africa. But even on the fertilizer side, we recognize that, in Africa, this whole question of uniform fertilizer recommendations is often a problem, that you can create an overuse of fertilizers. And so there is a technology that we are working on, which is called microdosing, which CIIFAD is working on, which is small amounts of fertilizer, as small as a bottle cap, and you can apply it to the bottom of the plant, and it's actually working very, very well. So point well taken. The work of AGRA is looking at integrated soil fertility management practices that combines fertilizers and also with the organic inputs. With respect to Daniel's question on one of your questions in respect to the cash crop intensification and this whole issue of complexity of it, if you look in Mali, for example, southern part of Mali, where commercialization of cash crops has been high, especially for cotton. And Peter Maitland did quite a lot of work in Burkina Faso, also looking at those systems. You find that the level of use of organic inputs and also fertilizers is much higher in those systems. Yields are much higher. And in fact, the income levels are also much higher. So I guess what I'm trying to suggest here is that we are not taking a simplified view of a green revolution that only segments staple crops and forgets about the cash crops. We can't work on cash crops as AGRA because we don't have the capacity to do that. As lots of other institutions doing that. But we are working to take advantage of the complementarity between the cash crop and the food crops. With respect to the issue of the commercialization and nutritional, I think one of the issues we should worry about is, when I was at IITA, we looked at what happened with soybean expansion in northern Nigeria. It was a hugely successful initiative. But as it got more commercialized, men began to take over the control. It's back to your question as well. Men began to take control of the soybean crop. And you see that trend almost all over the place. But the point I want to make is that I think even as one thinks about commercialization, we also have to think about how to achieve nutritional security. Because simply selling staple crop is not enough. You've got to diversify to other things like vegetables, fruits, and things like that will deal with the kind of malnutrition that you said you find there. And on Malawi, you said that, despite all the gains they've made, that poverty and all that continues to be high. Yes. You have a lot of poor farmers here, but the number of households that are net buyers of food has continued to go down in Malawi. And I remember when I went to Malawi, 5 years ago, I couldn't hold almost any kid in the village in my hand. That was how bad the malnutrition was. You go to Malawi today, you find kids that are playing football all over the little villages. And so I think the impact is very significant. But what needs to be done is to sustain that and also help the smallholder farmers to diversify out of just relying on maize. Because the problem with maize is that it's not always drought tolerant. So if they're hit with a shock, everybody goes down. So a lot of efforts are going into encouraging diversification into grain legumes, but also into cassava. Last point with respect to the land, I think I partially answered the question. I think land issues are really very critical, but whether or not securing land rights for women is going to be enough to handle all the problems, I don't think that's the case. But I think without having one, what you're going to find is that the fields that are women's fields are not going to benefit from certain kinds of technology. We mentioned the issue of improved fallows. One of the reasons why women farmers don't use improved fallows is that they have no security over the land. And also when you talk about the situation where you use land as a collateral for accessing credit, if you don't have access to it, as a woman, you really can't do it. So we have to make sure that there's equitable distribution of land, that the women have access to land, but that women have access also to other things. It's not just land. Information is a big issue for them to access markets, a lack of access to extension, and also lack of access to finance as a big issue.
I understand that some students may have to go to class. You can. We're going to go with another round of questions right now. We're going to start with Eric Thorbeck, Phoebe, this lady in the blue. Is there one final one? Oh, Ed. Sorry, Ed. Professor Thorbeck.
Thank you very much for an enlightening presentation. My first question is that in your earlier graphs, you essentially, this is on agricultural performance, yield, and so on, you stopped, I think, in 2001, 2003. And some people have claimed, including the World Bank World Development Report of 2008 on agriculture and development, that the acceleration of growth in a number of African countries in the first half of the second millennium did help agriculture. Frankly, personally, I don't think it did very much, but it might be useful to extend your graphs to incorporate more recent information. Second point is on subsidies. I agree very much with you, and there is a historical precedent, and of course I am old enough to know it quite well, very few people in this room are, which is Indonesia in the 70s. Indonesia was by far the largest rice importing country in the world. And when oil prices went up from about $5 a barrel to $35 a barrel, they decided to recycle the windfall profits of oil into agriculture. And the main way they did it was through a subsidy fertilizer. And this started the rice intensification program in Indonesia, which made Indonesia a surplus country, from the largest rice importing to a net exporting country. So that, I think, is an interesting precedent to look at. Finally, on the issue that you raised with regard to the Green Revolution, I cannot help but be skeptical. I wish that it would be really feasible, but the extreme diversity of conditions in sub-Saharan Africa, the extremely large number of commodities, as opposed to the Asian Green Revolution, which really was based on rice, wheat, and maize. And that doesn't mean that agriculture is not fundamental. I think agriculture is fundamental, but I am not sure that using the word green revolution is the best way to promote agriculture. And I wonder what your reactions to this would be.
Thank you. Phoebe, the lady in blue, and Ed.
Hi, I'm Phoebe. I study public policy, and I'm interested in the fact that you believe you'll need to work pretty closely with governments to have policies that support the work you're doing across Africa. And given that you acknowledge that these are not one-size-fits-all for the country, you'll be working with many different governments. And given that you have a lot of money to work with, I'm curious how you'll go about working with individual governments and how you'll look at ways to mitigate corruption while you're working within these policy areas.
My name is Teresa. Small businesses here in the U.S. even fail very frequently, and it's not just money, it's because of entrepreneurial type things like managing finances, how to start a business, managing employees, things like that. Is AGWA putting any effort into supporting the people, besides small loans and things like that, supporting the people that are trying to start small businesses and then maintain them?
Yes, quick question here. Thanks, Akin, for the nice presentation. I think there's a lot of assumption in the literature that this revolution is kind of one way, that if we get it right, it kind of maintains itself. I just came out of Zimbabwe for Easter holiday, and if you want a story that shows you how 20 years of progress in building this revolution can be reversed in a year, you could see that there. I wonder if there's anything that we could do, and I know this, you can only do so much, but in terms of protecting agriculture from the shocks that can come from, not only from economic systems, but also from political systems in a way that we can capture the progress that we've made.
All right. Thanks very much. Well, Professor, first, thank you very much for your comments. Let me say that the slides, if you actually looked at it beyond 2003, even to 2007, the trend it didn't change. It's basically the same trend all over with that. But we'll try and put that on it. With respect to the subsidy that you mentioned in Indonesia, I think that perhaps the Indonesian government was able to manage probably better the whole issue of elite capture. Because I think what tends to happen is you can have the set-aside monies, but it's really how you deliver the monies to those that need it. And in Africa today, what is really making it easier to do that is this network of agro-dealers that we have built all over the place. And those agro-dealers allows the farmer to get access to essentially a voucher from the government, and they can take it to the next agro-dealer shop in front of them, and they can cash, or they can receive the seed and fertilizers that they need. So you're providing the support, but also you're building the nascent private sector that will eventually take over. Finally, I think it's the whole issue of transparency. You know, today in Africa, we have a lot more civil society participation in the public sphere. And so they're holding governments more accountable than it used to be, when governments could get away with almost anything that they did. With respect to your skepticism about the Green Revolution, let me try and see whether I can help with that. If you look at the experience that I shared with Malawi, and you turn the other way and you look at Rwanda, Rwanda's agriculture 3 years ago was only growing at 0.7%. 2 years ago, they decided to go to Malawi and learn exactly the same lessons and design comprehensive farm support programs for their farmers in Rwanda. 2 years ago, they grew by 15%. Last year, they grew by 17%. So this is stuff that is happening on the ground, not something like a mirage that you think is going to happen. You take a look at Tanzania. In southern highlands of Tanzania, where AGRA and the government have been working for the past couple of years, the Minister of Agriculture of Tanzania mentioned at the World Economic Forum that 700,000 farmers in the areas where we had built agro-dealer networks and provided access to finance, they produce 5 million tons of maize, and that's more than the rest of the country. So the Green Revolution is not something of that it's actually happening right now. However, I think the key is to also understand that the diversity you mentioned, while important, in Asia, that diversity wasn't there, and it was homogeneous. You got one variety, and then you can spread it all around. The approach that we have taken at AGRA is to support national institutions to develop crop varieties that are adapted to different agroecological zones and niches that you have there. And that has a greater chance of success than what has been done before with just one variety, and you try to get it all across. So that's how we're trying to deal with that.
Don't get me wrong. I was not implying that no progress was taking place or that agricultural development is fundamental to Africa. What I was trying to say is that the term Green Revolution may connote the idea that you need something homogeneous across the whole of Africa. And that, I think, may be the false idea to convey. Okay,
I get your point. Phoebe's point with respect to the issue of corruption and how we deal with that. You know, one area that we have moved into right now is how to work with agricultural parliamentary committees in Africa. It's actually quite strange that on a continent where agriculture is so important, and many of the leaders come from rural areas, you don't have in many countries functioning agricultural parliamentary committees. Right? And so we have set up an alliance with the African agricultural parliamentary groups to be able to support their capacity, first to understand agriculture, to understand the dynamics of agriculture, and to understand the kinds of policy, institutional, infrastructure, and financing support that this kind of agriculture needs in today's world. And as part of that, they're also going to be having a lot of public fora to discuss the issue of why is it that certain programs work and other programs don't work. And part of that also has to do with the issue of transparency, good governance, and accountability. The other thing that we are doing is we are supporting farmers' advocacy platforms. I didn't get into a lot of details of what we're doing on policy, but a key component of that is to support farmers' advocacy platforms so they can really engage more and bring out their issues about why they're supposed to get this support and they're not getting that support. In terms of the small businesses and finance and what are we doing, I think with respect to small businesses, the real critical problem they have is actually just the capacity, right, to actually use the money. I mean, we have both Ed and Raf, we have a program called the SODP, which is Seeds of Development Program, in which you have a lot of SME seed companies that needed access to financing. But they found that the main problem, that challenge that they had, was really to build their own business skills, the business plans that you can provide to banks and so on. So I would say that a lot of support has to go into building that kind of business acumen within those businesses as a condition for them being able to access financing. And lastly, Ed's one on political risk, which is understandable. This is Zimbabwe, so it's got to have this political risk. But your point gets to the heart. I mean, two parts of why Zimbabwe's green revolution or whatever smallholder agricultural revolution fell apart. You know, it was driven heavily in the beginning by government, and when structural adjustment came, of course, that was all taken away. Secondly, is how you deal with the issue of land, and I think this is a sensitive issue in Africa. You look at South Africa, just across from you there. It's a huge problem in the sense that they were supposed to have what? By now, 30% of the land already are distributed to black farmers. So far, they have only 5%. So that remains an issue. And everybody talks about the willing buyer, the willing seller model. It doesn't really work. The willing buyer wants to buy, but the willing seller wants to sell at a price that the willing buyer cannot pay. So I think this is always going to be a challenge, and governments have to figure out a better way of dealing with this particular issue. The second one on political issue is the role that the African Union has to play. I think the commitment to CAADP is a very good one, and having a scorecard that you can use to measure the performance of countries is a very good one. And I might as well just end on that note by saying that AGRA is organizing in September of this year a forum called Africa Green Revolution Forum in Ghana, where we are bringing together heads of state, business leaders, bankers, civil society, farmers, to discuss what works, what doesn't work, and how do you scale up the things that are working. And part of that is to continue to put the pressure on the political elite to invest in agriculture and to invest right.
With that, ladies and gentlemen, let's thank the team.